Um, I just wanted to welcome and congratulate the students of the EDGE program. David Rue, who is finishing his first year as the chair of the post-grad department. He had a bold and interesting idea to introduce a new format of discussion at the end of the whole year that you guys spend with us here. We'll see how it goes. Like everything else here in SCI-Arc, we always try it and see how it operates. I think it's a provocative idea. I think it could be a different way to discuss work. I think at the postgrad level seems like a really good move to try to approach it in this way, to really not to take out the role of authorship or to take out the role of the individual contribution, but to really to think that many of the problems that you guys are trying to operate, they're much larger than one singular project, and these are incredibly complex problems to tap on sometimes a half-hour review. So that being said, all the programs, you guys have your final review like 3 weeks ago, the traditional final review. So this is more like what I will say is an act of generosity and hopefully contribution to a larger conversation. And if it all goes right, which I think it looks like it could be a good 4 days, this can become a new format on how the school discuss the work that the program produce and the students on the postgrad produce. The postgrad is a whole different animal altogether than some of the other programs. It's much more focused, it's much more intense. So hopefully today we'll share and shine a different kind of light about what is the nature of the work that all of you produce in relation with your instructor. Again, it's a unique, different system, since each program has a head professor that is involved somehow during the whole year. So it has, in theory, a much more coherent sequences of events. That always is open to be disputed, and I think that will be dissected in the autopsy that I think the panelists will embark later in this afternoon. So anyway, I want to thank all the students for the work, and I want to thank the guests and the panelists that David gathered for these 4 days, and I'll leave you in the capable hands of David Rue, the chair of your program. Thank you.
All right, just a few brief remarks before I introduce Peter Trummer to present the year in review for SCI-Arc EDGE Design of Cities. Welcome to the first EDGE symposium. So as Hernan alluded to, you could think of this as a kind of beta test of a new format for how we review the work and hopefully construct a discourse. So SCI-Arc EDGE is comprised of 4 postgraduate programs. They're each 3 semesters in length over 1 calendar year. The students they begin in the fall, they work through the spring, and then they finish here in the summer. Tonight's format is to have the leader of each of the programs. Tonight is the program coordinator for Design of Cities, Peter Trummer. And he's going to present in approximately 30 to 45 minutes some of the conceptual issues at work in the program and present the work of the students. This will be followed by a panel discussion afterwards. So the brief for this panel discussion, if you could excuse me reading this, this will be brief. We're going to discuss what is the role of finance in the design of cities today. Cities have traditionally represented cultural values and symbolized hierarchies of power. This we know. But what can a city represent and symbolize today when finance is the driving force? Are there opportunities, nonetheless, within the context of an asset-based urbanism. Looking past the need for representing normalcy and the status quo, which oftentimes serves the function of managing the risk of the investments. What might be the stranger aesthetic implications of what is beginning to appear as a post-humanist city that we're now all a part of? So with that brief prompt, I would just like to ask the 5 students in the program to just stand up for a second and just face the back wall, because this is being recorded and streamed. Okay? So, and hopefully there's more applause online. Yeah? But thanks for the hard work, and just want to acknowledge the great work the 5 of you did. Okay, so with that, I would like to ask Peter Trummer to come up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Sai. Thanks, David. And I want to use this opportunity to actually introduce the kind of program that I was asked, to coordinate with these 5 genius people. Yeah. Because the question to me was very, I wouldn't say difficult, but challenging in the sense of what would be a contemporary research on the city today. Yeah? And so after a lot of debates that I had outside of SCI-Arc or with colleagues here, and one of them also Matthew, I suddenly realized that perhaps it's time in which a new form of paradigm might be interesting to engage in and start to investigate what we could do as architects or as authors in the case of the city. So when I was, what I would like to do today is 2 things. I want to show you the kind of theme that has sort of covered the year program. I will give a kind of little bit of historical overview of how research had been done in the 20th century in relationship to the city as such, and then I will show you a kind of 5 projects, or you could say 5 models that have been investigated. So the topic that I thought I wanted to umbrella the project was in the idea of how would we think about the city in the age of the hyper-object. Now, of course, as you might see, the word relates to a philosopher called Timothy Morton that somehow described something which I would call the current zeitgeist, in the idea that today we might have reached a point in which human inventions, have somehow produced effects to which we have not really access to. Yeah? So in order to understand what would be then urbanism or design of city in that paradigm, I thought I'd show you a little bit the context to this question. So on the one hand side, I thought this is what we do. Technology is producing, cars, without a driver. And I have found interesting that there is an idea related to that, and in the future you will be insured, and you will get insurance if you don't drive by yourself. Then we have environmental phenomena like this. You can see it here. It's a kind of gigantic plastic lump in the middle of the ocean. And then we are designing cities that have no cars, that are purely investments. And then we have basically something like this, a city on the roof of a shopping mall. And then we have even buildings that we produce now that are having only the authorship of the sun. But the most interesting project that I have witnessed recently that gave me the idea of this kind of bare blue is this little window that I've shown in some of my presentations. This little window is designed by a non-architect. There's no author to this window. But the interesting thing of the window is that it had been happening within the regime of sustainability, and it was the renovation of a university building. What happened was that when this window was established and built, the authorities that had been responsible for the windows were asked, why is it that this window, that you cannot look outside anymore? Why is it that the window is framed in such a way that you cannot get air in? And the interesting thing was that the authority was saying, Mr. Trummer, you misunderstand this window. This window is not for humans anymore. The window is for the building. Yeah? And so in that context of understanding that we are producing objects and entities that are not anymore in the concern of what we think our buildings or our city should relate to, that's where I think the idea of the hyper-object emerges. And in a context, you could argue that what Timothy Morton says, these kind of hyper-objects are not simple mental construction by us anymore, but they are real entities that are withdrawn from us. So the idea of the whole investigation of the city was an investigation of the real, or trying to understand what can we learn from reality. But in order to understand how we would do this, I think I want to show you 3 positions that I think are important in the conversation of how we as architects, or the discipline of architecture, have thought about the real. The first, I would say, is something we would call empiricism, and it started within the 19th century by someone which is called Ildefons Cerdà. So Cerdà is the first person that invented the idea that in order to engage in an urban plan, I have to understand the reality as a statistical entity. Yeah? So what he wrote in his little brief, or basically in his plan of Barcelona, he thought that the rational human subject can, through statistical analysis, make a plan that orchestrates capital in the 19th century. And as many of us know, it was the city which we call the city of the neoliberal city. It means how do we orchestrate capital in a rational manner. So what he would do is he would suddenly realize how would infrastructure, what would be the most efficient idea of analyzing meshes or networks. It was the idea of orchestrating infrastructure in order to fulfill the demands of the inhabitation of the city. He would do analysis of grids, yeah, in which he would think about what's the most efficient way of how cars would identify. Or here, for example, one of his most interesting studies, how would a car cross a road? And he was the first parametricist. This is one of his formulas. He would have a parametric formula. What is the right square size of the grid? And he would start to have biopolitical entities of comparing the statistics, with air, size, economics. But what he also has done is, all thing was based on an idea of subdivision of land, because it was the idea that capital, in the sense of an asset property, would have to underlie all these constructions. And he has done finally a kind of legal certificate in order for this money to be orchestrated. So what we can say with Cerdà was, in his plan, he was the first one who identified a base of urbanization through rational means of subject, in which he would argue that in order to do an urban plan, we need to have a technical and administrative, a political, a legal, and an economical base, based on the idea of statistical artifacts of understanding reality as an empirical thing. Now, the second, I think, most important idea of how to understand the real was, I think, based on the idea of essentialism by someone, I would argue, Aldo Rossi. What Aldo Rossi and some of his colleagues did is they thought that in reality there is an essence to which we can have access to and we can learn from. And so, for example, one of his projects then was the idea that you can find in reality artifacts like, for example, this palazzo, and in these artifacts we will understand an essence of a kind of formal device, of an organizational device, with which we then can create our cities. All his research was in principle based on the first idea of typological thinking by someone called Muratori, who would somehow try to make a morphological reading of cities in Europe over 500 or 600 years, for example, this one here in Paris, and he would try to find where is there a formal type or an essence to which all these kind of, you could say, morphologies of the city has their grounding. So what this idea of essentialism meant was that if I take reality, I can learn from reality and I can invent an essence that identifies its typological paradigms. And as you can see, this is a diagram written in the 70s, yeah, where when we understand the city as a partie, we can abstract rational forms. They have fundaments, historical typologies, and we can give them back as an analogy. I'll give you one example for that. You can find it, for example, in a work of Ungers. For example, his Roosevelt plan for Roosevelt Island in Manhattan. What you see as a plan is not the idea, is the idea of the architect trying to think that he can recapturate the essence of Manhattan and produces out of the Manhattan grid and the Central Park an idea of miniature Manhattan as an exploration of a reality that is reflecting the essence of that city. But what they all have done is they still thought that imagination seems to be enormously important element, because as you can see in the analysis of these blocks, they were all taken from reality and then reassembled in such a way to come up with new types that have their essence based in reality. Now the last position I think we might know is the one of the surrealists, and especially the one that Rem Koolhaas used from Salvador Dali, in which he applied the idea of the critical paranoid method as an understanding of the city. What Koolhaas did is he used reality to make up or to fake or to basically accumulate a kind of reality that is not yet there, but already has all the ingredients if it would exist. So as we know from that thesis, it was the idea by shifting the understanding or shifting the narrative, I can construct out of things that exist another form of a reality for which we can then understand or proclaim the city. And as you can see, this was the kind of diagram that Koolhaas was using. You know, it was a comic, a cartoon of 1907 of trying to understand that the high-rise tower is actually the accumulation of different worlds above each other. This then was linked together with the Downtown Athletic Club. From there, it's taken the 9th floor, and in the 9th floor, there's an image made of telling the city is the producer of a form of bachelor that only the metropolis exists and no one else. So with that idea that there was a rational understanding of reality, a kind of essentialist idea of reality and a surrealist, what our program was about is what if we can look into the idea of understanding the thing from a realism viewpoint. And what it means is, what if we not only learn from that what is out there, but what if the city already has produced by its economical, sustainable, and other means of forces, already new types of models of the city itself. And so what I have asked the students is to go out there, dive into contemporary production of projects, yeah? Like, for example, the one in Georgia Tech, or, for example, the one in Singapore, or the one in Istanbul, or a recent project like this, and ask yourself what lies underneath these models, what kind of other type of building or city lie there. And so the students have come up with actually 5 models that reality produce it and accelerate them, and I think we have named them in a kind of the fake city, the desert city, the mountain city, the machinic, and the biomorphic. And so what I want to do is I show you shortly each of these little projects and how they have in principle taken what already reality has produced and basically turned them into a kind of model for a new kind of city. The first project I want to show you is Yen's idea of the machinic city. What she has found out that in a project in Atlanta, she started to realize that the city is produced not only more as we understand it as a conventional understanding of a generic ground on which we stand buildings on there, but there is a whole kind of set of economic development underneath the city that in principle operates as a machinic ground for which a city can be built. And so what she started to do is to make here a kind of accelerated model, yeah, of a plinth, yeah, that incorporates actually what usually all the grid of a city has, yeah, and turned it into its own asset to which then any kind of generic city can be built on. Here you can see some of the projects, you know, and in the context of a new urban environment, it would mean that what you usually see as a diagram, that you see the road becoming the, you could say, collective money to which any kind of private investment can emerge, suddenly the infrastructure becomes a private investment. And she then, in the end, located her project in the middle of the desert in Dubai, where a new city has been born without any kind of coherent grid or underneath base to which a city can be built. The second project I would like to show is the mountain city by Siba. And she became interested in a very interesting biopolitical phenomena that actually started already with the first plan of Le Corbusier. What Le Corbusier did, especially in its middle part, you know, the setbacks, is trying to understand that how would density look like, yeah, if we look at it from a biopolitical point of view. That means basically that we need air and sun in order to live in. But when she then discovered her project on the OMA, Ole Scherden in Singapore, she realized that there is a diagram at stake, but at the same time the diagram has shifted all its content, and the content evaporated, but in principle the diagram still stayed alive. That meant in principle that it looked like still as if it would have anything to do with biopolitical reasons, but actually became a pure amount of investment of money through exposure. And so then she accelerated this idea into the mountain, which in principle incorporates as a single object, you know, the city and its ground in one entity. And here you can see some of the public spaces. So she kept all the diagrams of Le Corbusier alive, but it turned another entity of even assemblage of money. The third project is called the Fixity. It's an investigation by Yamar into the economics of Istanbul. In her hometown, she found out that new forms of illegal investments are happening that are using military territories, yeah, in the middle of the city in order for allowing developers with, against any rules and without any kind of encapsulated money to develop for these kind of illegal islands. What you can see is they most of the time look very similar. They have a kind of strange ecological plinth or kind of ground, yeah, to which then some towers emerge. But what happens is with these towers is that the towers in principle finance underneath a kind of fake public, a public that is constructed but has nothing to do with the city as such, as you can, for example, see within her marina project. So what she has developed is a new type of plinth, whereby the plinth orchestrates a kind of accumulation of fantasies, or not real aggregates of public life. Here you can see a kind of, instead of a shopping mall, she put all kind of public events into this kind of plinth. And then she produced a kind of sensational park to which then the generic money of the single investment finances the project underneath. And here you would see this kind of island with a little bit less windows. The fourth project by Marco is the hypothesis on the investment of the idea of the desert city. As we know from the history of architecture, there have been, from the beginning of the garden city until today, the idea that we could make a city, yeah, that is in a principle in the middle of nowhere, but it only is based on an idea of infrastructure. And so what he thought of, what if this solar panel system turns into the infrastructure in which an investment can be made for a city as such. And so here, for example, he combined, on the one hand side, a typology that you would find in New York. Then he combined it with an ecological system based on the solar power stations with an idea of neighborhood making, and came up with this kind of post-human city that looks like and has all the ingredients that a city has, but it only doesn't have people. The only thing what it does is it's a lay down of investment, and the only thing what sustain it is the energy of the solar panel, and it's kind of a project with which you can wait, yeah, until some kind of investment will be made once, yeah. And so here you can see that city in the middle of a desert. So the last project takes on the idea of a biomorphic city by Adrian. She became fascinated in the idea of the city on the one hand side as a food production or as a kind of productional space of constructed environments, but more and more she became interested into the aesthetics of its appearance. And so her belief was that we can construct these kind of bubbles, you know, under which a kind of new form of environmental organism can be applied onto the city and generate a kind of new space of production onto the city itself. And so what she did in her final work is to show how this image, how such a thing like downtown could suddenly transform, you know, and get an aesthetic of this kind of biomorphic understanding of a new form of production within the city. So in order to finish this little presentation, I want to take, I think, one image from Yamar's work that I think essentializes more or less or captured the whole idea that has been sort of produced within the five projects. When we looked at the city of the captive globe from the 1970s, it was still the belief that the understanding of social utopias, you know, has a common welfare state grid, yeah, like Manhattan, under which all this kind of social excitement can work as islands. The idea of the financial capital of the, or basically of the diagram of the city today is the totally reverse. What you have is not anymore a generic grid, but a generic plinth, but what you have is a fake plinth of a kind of constructed in public, but where the towers are so generic and produce all the money in order for that city underneath to live. So what you have is the grid as the common ground that the city basically needed as a production of collective and money in order for private investment, turned into inverted model in which the tower turns into a generic money in order for a fake public to occur. And I think with this idea of the kind of her diagram for the financial capital, I think it summarizes somehow the intentionality of what could be a model, yeah, of the city in the age of the hyper-object. So, and I want to say thank you also as a final thing to Matthew Scholes. Without his thesis and his contribution, you know, some of their work wouldn't have reached the depth. Yeah? And of course, I want to thank all you five guys and Wilhelm. Otherwise, the work wouldn't look as that what it is. So, thank you very much.
All right, we'll see if we can make some sense of this now. One of the principles of formatting our year-end review in this manner is so that we could just assess to some degree what has been the outcome of the year of work, so that we don't just repeat it again next year, but that we use that then as the end point of this as the starting point for the next year. So that is also the logic of scheduling it how we did, so that there's a kind of passing of the baton to the next generation of students, some of whom are here. Okay, so this is the week of new student orientation, et cetera. So I find it important to try to, as often happens in academic program work, that the discoveries on the work kind of poof, goes up in smoke, and then somehow you do it again, So what I'd like to try to do to try to establish some categories for what we see here is maybe to try to, for myself, to clarify this word that was used in my prompt, that is the post-humanist city. What exactly did I mean by post-humanist? Why didn't I call it post-humanism like Peter did? So I think that might be a point of debate itself to begin. Now, just to get the discussion rolling, I'll say a little bit about why I chose the word I did, and then end with a question to Peter. Okay. In contrast to the more typical term post-humanism, which speaks to, I suppose, the contemporary situation where more and more so our society seems to be built and constructed on protocols that do not have the human being at its center. Now, I modified that a little bit to refer to as post-humanist, as perhaps in some relationship to post-humanism, but to really provoke a response about is this really the end of the humanist period? That is the period of enlightenment really at a close? Not to say we're no longer enlightened. I think we carry with us everything that's been evolving since the 18th century. However, are we at the beginning of something else now? Something else that's the focus beyond just the appearance of a regime of rationality into Western society and the construction of ethics and values primarily around the construction of that rationality. So if we just assume that maybe that rationality just as a default condition now that we inherited, now what is the next project? I think to establish the next project, we always need to see what are the problems that we have. And it strikes me in the life of cities today, probably the most disturbing thing for the architect is the enormous motivating force of capital and investment being really the answer that comes to define almost every question. So those of us that are interested in culture and aesthetics and perhaps the legacy of the humanist tradition, I think we're often put in the position of maybe window dressing capital, that we position capital or we deliver aesthetic regimes that somehow mitigate what the work that capital is doing in reshaping our cities. So I'm going to just pass it to you, Peter, okay, because my question is just a simple one. in relationship to what I just said about what might be, what we might come to understand as a post-humanist project, what do you see as the relationships to the post-humanism that you're interested in? Which maybe is, in some sense, a darker premise than what I just spoke of.
You know, perhaps I'm sometimes not aware about this darkness, but I want to explain, and I hope I could explain it in my little reference historically, what I found interesting today. I think if we look at urban design over the last 150 years, and I think that's where I started with Cerdà as the beginning of what we constitute as the discipline of planning and the discipline of urban design, was the idea of orchestrating a form for money. It is really interesting that the grid, the layout, the idea of the grid, was in principle the understanding, yeah, that this is the neoliberal city. It's a city made by money. What kind of form do we give him? And I think it was very, for me, this is the beginning of my form of humanist city, because this was the understanding how we think the city in relationship to capital. Because before, we thought the city always as a social identity. The Middle Age city, the Greek city, the polis, the Roman fortress, the civitas, the society. We always named it. I think Cerdà made, for me, a very interesting distinction. He invented the word urbanism in opposition to the idea of city, which is a word related to civitas or society. Because he wanted to say, in the idea of pure amount of capital, what we do or we design is just the orchestration of infrastructure and architecture of inhabitation. Yeah? And so that's why I found that for me an interesting point. And what he then thought the human subject is, it was a pure statistical entity.
Okay.
So the idea was suddenly, reality is not anymore the people, we as a political construct, we are just statistics. Yeah? And that's why I then looked into Rossi, because he already eliminated the idea of programming, meaning that what usually the city should be for, function or activity. He said, no at all, the reality has produced forms, and this is what architects construct the city. And that forms have been, of course, culturally produced, yeah, because they come from our history of living. But what is interesting is, he still thought that we can use imagination, yeah? Or we need to be imaginative to play with these typologies. And then I found interesting that when I came then to Koolhaas with the idea of surrealism, it was the idea to say, yes, we have to fake a reality. There is already, we will never have access, we fake it. So what I found interesting in the idea of the thesis of Timothy Morton's and the idea of the hyperobject is, what if we really look only into how money or how ecological or global warming, what would be the objects that are produced by that kind of instruments?
Okay,
yeah?
So I wanted to just throw the question at Peter before we do anything here, because I wanted this to function as a just kind of introduction to our panel here. One final remark. I think this was what I was hoping the difference might be, that this issue of realism that you emphasized in your presentation, I suppose it is very much related to the problem of capital and money, that in this kind of emergence of rationalism in the production of cities, there's a kind of unfortunate after effect where we become kind of statistics, if you will, or numbers. We become metrics, and somehow simultaneously the appearance of rationality kind of, in some sense, dehumanizes. So maybe that's enough of our kind of setup here. So I would like to just quickly introduce those on the panel, and then I'm just going to let it go into a kind of free-for-all here. From my immediate left, we have, of course, Peter Trummer. We have John Enright, who's the Vice Director of SCI-Arc and Principal of Griffin Enright. We have Matthew Soul, who's a professor at the University of British Columbia, and Matthew Soul, architect. We have Eric Anoyu, who just recently joined us here at SCI-Arc. He is one of our history theory faculty members and the coordinator of research, right? I don't know if that's the correct title.
Yeah.
Okay. We have Marika Trotter, who's also our new history theory faculty and coordinator of history theory in general here at SCI-Arc, so welcome. And of course, we have at the far end of the table our former director, Eric Owen Moss, and principal of Eric Owen Moss Architects. So with that, the question here is just how do we deal with this kind of post-humanist or humanism reality that we have? How do we deal with money? What is the role of architecture in this kind of time of finance-driven urbanism?
Maybe I'll just,
This is a, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, fine. It's a difficult discussion to have, I think, without trying to understand some definitions, to say the obvious. So if we accept whatever exactly the premise is, post-human, are we ready for post-human?
I don't know, maybe not.
Finance, what's money? What do you mean finance? What does it mean? What's it mean? I mean, Spengler wrote an essay, Blood Over Money. Nuremberg is a piece of a city. It's probably blood over money. So I think, I don't want to unravel it entirely, but I think to try to understand what there is in a city which is durable, sustainable, but not in the horticultural sense, what belongs intrinsically to a conception of a city, what is it, why is it? And I think in this context, in a place like SCI-Arc, the objective ultimately, or the aspiration of the students, is to make something unorthodox or new or different. That's the goal. And the question is whether that goal has to be scrutinized a little bit. In other words, what changes, what stays the same, and aren't all of those operating together? Because my sense of the five was that they're very one-dimensional kinds of projects. They're about single issues. And the conception of the city, the pieces of the city are if not single-minded or simple-minded, that the intricacies of cities built over long periods of time, which add and subtract for various reasons, social and political and all of that, and there's no sense of those kinds of issues which are enduring issues in cities. So I think some of those questions we have to kick around a little bit, or we just go one by one and talk about the pieces.
I think we
Otherwise, I don't
good to kick it
know,
around.
what
a
are we
little bit
talking about?
Yeah.
add one aspect to this, which at the risk of it maybe being obvious, I think it's just important to recognize that that of course this, I mean, we're talking about money, capital, and I think it's important to ask, you know, what is money, what's its role, what is capital, what's its role, and then in the search for the unorthodox to sort of ascertain what is maybe new about the now as a harbinger or opportunity for a new set of unorthodoxies. But in that recognition, or in that kind of discussion, I think it's important to really emphasize that the city has always been in some way or form, in part, an orchestration or organization of capital, right? Since its invention, you know, if we look at sort of industrial capitalist city, the consumer capitalist city, and what we might now call the financial capitalist city. So it seems to me that it's kind of the question of what is different about finance capitalism vis-a-vis earlier modes of capitalism, like industrial capitalism, is one of the core things that one needs to untangle in this discussion, because it seems to me that finance capitalism really emphasizes a post-productive form of capitalism. I say post-productive as a kind of post-making of things capitalism. And so how that post-productivity interfaces with the act of making that architecture typically and traditionally entails.
Just in principle, as a premise, is capital a pejorative term?
I don't think so.
I mean, is the implication that all of this discussion is sitting on what capital does and how capital behaves, and in the context of this discussion, that's not so good? It's dirty, or it's not what thing. It's sitting on that, but it shouldn't be sitting on that, and if it were sitting on something else, it would be something else? Or that's what we're stuck with, and so that's what we have to deal with?
Well, I'm open to other comments that you might want to tag onto it, but as far as I'm concerned, capital is just oxygen at this point, and I don't think it's as wise or unwise as trying to put a value on something that surrounds us as the very basis of life. So I would like to pursue kind of a discourse about the role of capital in the production of cities, just accepting that it's a given. And it's, I would only venture to say it would be a mistake to try to make a value judgment on capital at this point.
I think, to add to that point, anytime you make stuff, you spend money to make it. And we have, in the history of the city, there's one precedent that I think you should put in next year, Peter, yes. Which is Lisbon, 1756, 7, 8.
Oh, yeah.
Because there you have a one-dimensional city conceptualized from scratch, which was purpose-built, actually, to make the move from a religious infrastructure that had been built over time to a commercial infrastructure that was built with the intent to maximize profit and to maximize it quickly. And in fact, the grid there was such a predominant factor in the way money was seen to accumulate and risk was seen to be managed. And those two things obviously go together when the former urban center has been liquefied due to the largest earthquake known at the time. So the management of risk and the accumulation of capital came together in a grid that was actually tethered to the ground, which was now seen as unstable, with a structural system that was actually borrowed from shipbuilding. So you have this incredible image, right, of a city that for the first time floats above the ground. It doesn't actually have a connection to the ground. Its stability is commerce, money, and the management and elimination of risk. And that becomes such a predominant model that when the orchestrator, the bureaucrat behind Lisbon, decides that he needs to find new ways to expedite the increase of capital in the cash-strapped Portuguese empire, he goes and he deploys that exact same grid with the exact same coordinates, oriented to the exact same degree in completely far-flung areas of Portugal. So that you actually, today, you can go look on Google Maps, which is great, we have that tool now, and you can actually overlay those grids in completely separate, far-flung corners of the country. So this is an image of some abstract mesh or net that can somehow be deployed to turn something that wasn't real enough into something that is now as real as it gets.
You see, and just to understand, this is my discovery over that, is that grid, now, just to be clear, I think came already in the Greek city, in Milet, yeah? So it is the beginning of construct. If you have to put something down, you make a grid. But I would say the grid is the pure distinction between what is privately owned versus what is collectively owned. And the only thing I discovered in this year is there is a model of capitalism, there's an architecture model emerging out of capital to which the grid might be under question and be replaced by private investment. Yeah? And to come only back to Eric's idea, you see, it's probably we took it a little bit too far, but what the idea was is that this reality produces ideas. Let's say let's call them types, nearly. Yeah. And now the question is, what do you do then with them as an architecture model? But I remember, I'm writing now for you an article of your master plan. Yeah. And what was really interesting to me is I saw a lot of projects, grids, towers, that all resemble a certain idea of a historical moment, a political and economical moment, yeah, that has been taken away of the content, but only the form then is alive. Yeah? And I think the only thing what we try to do is, what if reality produces already the type to which we just give a form? Yeah? Probably, and that's why I think America is right. The conclusion why I used the end of this image was the grid, as that what usually was the orchestrator between private and public, might have been erased in contemporary forms of capital. That's the only hypothesis.
But look, my point, I think, is a little bit different. If you go back to the issue of the city of money or the city of finance, there's another way. First of all, there's state capitalism of various kinds. Some people call it fascism, some people call it communism, some people call it whatever they like. But the state makes a decision. So the investment and the meaning of investment is very different than private capital. And the role of the government in various degrees, even in this country, may determine the content of the project. If you're talking about a state and Hitler Speer built Nuremberg, let's say. And I don't know that anybody is counting the cost or looking at what might come back from that. So it's not a matter of money in and money out. It's different, like blood over money. So when we talk about this, the question, the most interesting city would have been to take all five and put them together.
Yeah.
And I think if you took all five and put them together, you would start to have the ingredients that seem to belong to the kind of messy complexities that cities develop over long periods of time, which raises a different question about whether this is an instant city in the middle of nowhere or an instant city in the middle of an existing city, or whether it's a hypothesis to deal with the cities that are problems in the world or issues, New York or LA or Hangzhou or Lisbon or whatever it is. So I think that's another question, which is to try to define if this is a solution. If it is, it's a solution to what problem? What problem are you solving? What issues are you advancing? Otherwise, the thing is terribly ambiguous. And so, did they get it right?
Well,
who got it right?
Yeah, I want to add something to that, or respond a little bit to it. And so I saw some of these projects a couple of weeks ago, so I have a little bit of an advantage. So saw those, so I've had time to think of them. But I wanted to address a couple things. One, when David speaks of post-humanism or ist, I'm not sure I know the difference. But we must remind ourselves that those elements of the city have existed always, whether this is infrastructure, the LA River, power lines, cement batch plants, grain silos, right? So those elements exist and have existed in cities. I think and so I object to the statement, the post-humanist city, but I agree to elements of it. My favorite project, or the one that resonates, I think, to what I think the studio is, I guess is called Fixity, which is the one with the tiny little towers. which I'm not sure if you explained completely, and since I saw
Please,
it
yeah.
twice, maybe I could add to it.
Yes, please.
If I understood the thesis of that, and I'm most interested in the pencil-thin towers a la Manhattan, a la zombie urbanism. And when we had a discussion about that project, and what was interesting about it was in cities now there are manifest, and this is the difference between infrastructure and buildings that are representing capital, like those buildings, which are essentially, to go over it quickly, very small footprint, super thin buildings that are tall, that are investment properties for 0.001% of the global population and are not occupied. So what makes them odd is that they're not occupied. Not really architecturally that interesting. They happen to be thin. They happen to exist in the city in a certain kind of way. But unlike real post-humanist things, these become post-humanist because they're not occupied. So they become a symbol of capital, meaning, and to say they're not occupied means they're seldom used, right? As kind of, this is, maybe I come 1 week to New York, and when we talked about the students' project, we said, well, you have to represent it with all the windows dark, right? Because if you show life in it, this misses the point. Now, that, I think, is what, maybe one example of what you were trying to get into. Then it's interesting, Peter, that then you want to go to the formal, because your favorite part of the project is the bottom, which says we don't need the grid anymore, because the grid is what made the upper part, and in its generic state, this is the form of capital. How that relates maybe to Delirious New York, or the notion of corporate symbolism of towers and their identity. I think it tries to invert that. It says, no, that's generic. Here's the life of the city. So I'm just trying to shed light on what I saw in the studio, what I think is somewhat interesting, although I would say that when we talk about modes of economy, and again, these aren't cities, these are projects in the cities. These are big buildings. They're not city plans, although I like Eric's idea of combining them all. I would want, though, or next steps, like next year or in the future of this, that the economic model, and this gets back to Eric's points of the definitions for different parts of the world with different kinds of political structures, that more definition of what the economical or the capital stance really is in the project, and a little bit sharper. So while the project I explained I liked, it's a real diagram, and it's very simple. And the complexities of capital and movement, I think, are really rich and could probably start to create more fissure and maybe get to what I think Eric's interest is in the provisional aspects of a city, more difference, more things happening, as opposed to looking for the diagram to end all and define what the problem is.
But do we need, for that, do we need to know specific instances of actual capital generating space?
Yes.
Because I think then that would change, like if we're looking at abstract principles of the way the capital is forming space, it looks like one thing. But if we look at it kind of enacting itself in space, we can see it looking at something else, because all I hear from the kind of developers who are amassing capital in order to alter this city or any other is that they're under the constraint of having to operate on the kind of playing field that they've been given. So that this kind of regulatory structure, like the money is water, and the water needs a place to flow. But the place to flow is given structure by often a conflicting and arbitrary set of rules set up by people with very different agendas who have most of whom have almost no interest in the form of the city. And so the money has to flow through those kind of channels and kind of create the city that those channels have given the opportunity to exist. So in a sense, I would say that, like, to go to Peter's argument about the grid, I would say that the grid, and maybe to compare that to Marika's, that if the grid was kind of put in place there, or in the Jeffersonian grid, or the one we see in New York, if they're all about creating a spatialized abstraction that uproots from the ground, that kind of allows that coordination of action to be separate from the ground beneath it, then the grid is still dictating all of these new forms of structure, even if they don't sit on what looks like a spatialized grid anymore, because they're all displaced. They all float. And I think that floating is a side effect of capital. And we can say that there are other principles, to the other Eric, There are other principles that have created urban space, right? The state, religion, this kind of maybe some kind of a fundamental human urge to build buildings at all was not built on capital at first, or as far as we can tell, looking into deep history. However, we can say that the vast majority of urban space that was ever built was built because of capital and wasn't built by money, but it's built by money, for money to occupy, but only for money to occupy in that moment. And that what we see, and I think this goes to Eric's point, that what becomes interesting about the city is that it's still there after money doesn't care about it anymore. And so that layering of the five maybe over time. Like when a new principle and a new reason to build, a new kind of set of rules through which money can express itself in space comes in, it inherits a different world, a world that already exists and that was built for an outmoded variety of capital's self-expression.
But none of these schemes accommodate transition over time.
Not at all, no.
I mean, if you take the solar thing or whatever it is, that seems to have something to do with the contemporary condition of existing technologies or relatively soon-to-come technologies, and it sets out a whole pro forma, an organizational pro forma, how it works, I'm not so sure. And then that becomes the basis of the city, which is likely to be an anachronistic basis in 20 minutes. I think part of the problem with these schemes is that I think there's a confusion between an architectural solution and an urban solution, as if they're conceptual urban, so this, but maybe this is an obvious point, but they're conceptual urban strategies of various kinds, and they're sort of decorated with contemporary building typologies, with roofs and walls and holes and bridges and columns and whatever they are. And there might be at least a strategic question of whether you want to bother with that at all. I mean, for instance, the towers that John was talking about, you could say, build elevators, build stairs a mile high, build a frame, and sometime in the future, somebody will come and put whatever they want to put on it. I mean, this is also a bit of an anachronism. But then you differentiate between the organizational pieces and the finishing. And the finishing belongs to a different discussion because it'll happen over time and it'll happen for different reasons. I don't think anybody made those distinctions. So it looks like a big piece of architecture. All 5 schemes look like that.
I mean, look, I think there are 2 things that are now important. One is, how do you represent something? I mean, here comes a question of representation in a certain way, yeah, on the one hand side, but also one is a question of content. You see, there is a disbelief in that 5 projects, including me, is that there is something like a generic infrastructure to which you build anything on. Yeah, I think that's my disbelief. Everything that exists today, yeah, is just done. It's complete. Yeah, perhaps it's too far stretched. Yeah, but the idea that I saw in, let's say, either socialist, welfare state-related companies, where there is a generic infrastructure to which life emerges, yeah, I think that is really, to me, under question. Now, I'm not saying that we are there, but I think that's interesting. And so, for example, someone only builds an elevator if he only has a floor plate related to that. Yeah, so it's really interesting to me, the idea, can infrastructure, yeah, be that what we have as a collective, yeah, shared, to which all our excitement goes? That's a big question. Yeah, and so what the projects try to say is that in current modes of capitalism, what you see in the world, it doesn't matter in which master plan I look at, it's always a complete work. It's that amount of money that is available to make this project. I remember last year we made a research onto the Abdullah master plan in Riyadh. It was interesting. It looks like a plan, meaning it can have diversity of towers, but it's one construction. It's one political decision. It's one decision of money. And I think that's where I wanted to go underneath the kind of propaganda of representation that these kind of projects currently have, because they assume as if they are a city of Le Corbusier, here's the great and free capital can float. No, they are accumulation of large money orchestrated in one project. And so why these things look like islands or entities is because that's how the city is constructed today. Yeah? And perhaps it's misrepresented in a certain way, or it could have been another genre.
But it wouldn't, look, it wouldn't have to be that way at all. I mean, the name of the class is The Edge City.
Yeah.
Okay? So you've already told us that the edge is definitive, and within it, which is interesting in terms of what a city means, because in a way, you're in, you mean something, you're out, you mean something else. And the parameter, this is, I think, historically true.
Yeah.
Now, whether it's a plan edge or a section edge, how do you define the edge in this dimension? But there are other ways. In other words, these things could dribble off into everywhere. You know, they don't have to be defined as an entity. They could coalesce, they could dissipate, they could do all kinds of things. They didn't do that. You know, so it's a question of how you mix the pieces in, and that's the issue of the edge. Like, why'd you call it the edge? Everybody has the same edge. You got 5 edges, they're all the same. And there are, which is okay, but they're just, in terms of definitions, again, there are lots of different kinds of edges, and some are more permeable to the point that they would dribble off asymptotic to infinity, as opposed to being defined, which is a different kind of city. It sort of goes for, I mean, if you fly over Mexico City, it's a little bit like that, or LA too. You know, it's just the old joke, you take off from JFK, you're already over LA. Mm-hmm. And it just keeps going. And it's a different kind of edge.
And really, the Tim Morton departure point would argue that kind of edgelessness, or that the edge needs to be located somewhere other than a kind of restricted space. So, yeah, if you're using a hyperobject, then yeah, well, how do these 5 projects get us to the idea of the hyperobject? I mean, you've made an argument about it as a non-programmatic or non-occupational aspect, but is there also kind of a spatialized version of that, or could there be?
Well, you know, now that everybody's fired their first shots, with regards to the hyperobject, I think to some degree, like Tim's favorite example, especially right now, of the hyperobject is hurricanes or global warming. Like, things are just too vast for us to comprehend, and also because we're somehow in it too. I suppose capitalism itself could be thought of as a kind of preeminent hyperobject, but maybe to try to narrow the conversation, narrow the bandwidth a little bit, I wanted to try to put a little more attention on this question of representation in relationship to the life of capital in design, particularly of cities. So I first came across Matthew Soul's research into asset-based urbanism around 4 years ago. And it was like Colonel Kurtz says in Apocalypse Now, like a diamond shot through my forehead, you know? I was flabbergasted, like, is this true? Was, I think, the first question I was thinking to myself, that these massive investments that are producing almost practically elephants in plain sight that you don't see, like the tallest residential tower in Manhattan, for example, by Vignoli and Deborah, right? Where full-floor apartments average $40 million. The penthouse sold for $96 million. The entire thing was sold out before it was even topped off, and nobody lives there. Now, I was totally astonished by this, and that things like this were happening without most of us, and speaking for myself, I had no idea something like this was happening in the world. So I didn't see it because it was designed to look like other architecture. That it didn't really stand out as something out of the ordinary. They're quite large, spectacular, if you will. But design played a role, essentially. I thought, I could draw no other conclusion from this, that it gave the investment cover. It hid, to some degree, camouflaged the kind of non-occupancy of this new kind of architecture, and that they were primarily devices for investment. So I found that quite disturbing, just as an architect, where I felt a little bit strangely implicated in these kinds of current events. Right? So one of the things that really came out of our discussions this year, especially between you, myself, and Matthew, was just this very basic question of the mortgage. It is the mortgage that's like the kind of primary instrument of deploying capital in the service of building. And you pointed out to me that this was a pretty interesting research. Matthew, you pointed out somebody was looking into, at the last Venice Biennale, you said, like, how do you define what you can give a mortgage for? How do we define a minimum dwelling that we could call architectural or occupiable, at least, to the degree that a bank will have confidence to issue a mortgage, that is, deploy financing? And in the service of that, say, architects would have to prove that or evidence that. So the most disturbing thing to me, ultimately, in the Pencil Tower in Manhattan by Vignoli, was beyond how expensive all the apartments were and how no one was living in it, that it primarily marketed itself through certain images of fantasies of occupation. That is, a gigantic square picture frame window looking out onto Central Park with the largest bathtub you've ever seen. You know, it constructs a kind of strange desire or plausibility for occupation. It's a pure representation, right? It's a piece of design, in other words. But it's not design deployed in the way we would traditionally expect design to be deployed. So with that long kind of narrowing here, I think I'd like to know a little bit more about how we might be able to advance the program as a representational project in conjunction with economic models that we inherit and then perhaps can invent some new ones too. It may not exist, but it might be yet plausible if we think carefully enough.
I mean, of course, there are a number of economic models, and then there's a question of whether you want to acquiesce. In other words, I mean, you package mortgages that people can't pay, you put them together, and you sell them, and the economy crashes. So, if you want to understand the mechanism, I think part of the discussion has to do with the fact that it's subject to all sorts of abuses, and then the question is, do you want to decide that the projects you're offering are contingent on an understanding of a particular way of financing the project, or they should be the product of a different way of financing the project? So you'd come after financing in a critical way in the same sense that you might come after the making of architecture in a conceptual sense in a critical way. And then when you get into bigger projects, I mean, all I have to do is look at the idiocy that's going on with projects in Moscow and things like that, and whatever any of that ultimately means, which is a discussion somewhere else, but some oligarch somewhere who launders money somehow, and so that the context of bigger projects around the world and the financial criteria, whatever it is, seems to be quite different than when you're talking about conventional mortgages. It's very different. On top of which, I mean, in this country, and we're familiar with this, I certainly am, that the constraints on buildings through the eyes of bankers, what the hell are you doing, Moss, And I mean, we've been dealing with that for a long, long time. And so you have to find a way to speak in their, you have to extrapolate enough from what they're doing to speak in their language enough to get done what you want done, but without ever subscribing to the pro forma, which is based on something, some priority, some value system. This matters, this doesn't. And this is why. And we don't agree with most of that. We work with it, but so I don't know, there's an argument for going the other way. How should it be done? How could it be done? And then the question is, how implausible is whatever you're proposing? Or can you work within a system and bend the system,
Right.
but keep it however attenuated it doesn't collapse, I mean, is it a fantasy we're talking about, or are we talking about something that might be realized, which is another discussion altogether? Are any of these projects realizable? Should they be?
It seems that so a more pointed, we're working the conversation into a more pointed discussion about the particularities of finance as opposed to the generalities of capitalism, which I think is important. And I just want to say maybe also some obvious things, because I think part of the answers to these questions reside in the recognizing some of the dominant characteristics of the now, which is really, I think, the evidence suggests that since somewhere around the 1970s, as the world economy has integrated to degrees to which it has never been integrated before, the real estate industry, and towing along with it the things we do as architects, has begun to occupy the most significant portion of the world economy, which is, I think the evidence suggests, an unprecedented condition that buildings and the money that's captured in them is the single biggest component of world economics. But how that impacts the function of the buildings within the economy is through not them so much embodying a fixed manifestation of capital that has to do with the developer's initial investment and the kind of costs of constructing the building, which have always been a kind of given. So now I think it's more about the products of architecture as exchange devices within a financialized economy. So the way in which mortgages intersect with them, the way in which insurance intersects with them, and how that connects into a larger set of kind of abstract representations of buildings. So the kind of real financial life of buildings are not the buildings themselves, but the way in which they allow themselves to be conduits for all these devices that intersect with a larger economy. So I think that role that they take means a number of things to their transformation that we can recognize, one of which is a sort of move towards increased fungibility, or the ability to easily exchange buildings. Buildings have traditionally been very hard to buy and sell. So the sort of move towards fungibility changes the aesthetics of them, changes the form of them. And I think a question becomes like, what are the lurking representational opportunities, even programmatic opportunities to contest or surf or I think, Eric, you're raising a whole set of vital questions. What is one going to do in response to these things? So you can work with them, work against them, find cracks and fissures and opportunities. But I think one of the big questions of where those opportunities lie and where positions can be staked out is in relation to this question or this project of fungibility, right? This sort of like making buildings consciously and subconsciously, because it's sort of an ideological paradigm, a sort of easily exchangeable intermediary devices for larger economic apparatus. I mean, I think to do that means, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the projects that we see here are incredibly, I mean, they are simple and singular and unlike cities that most of us, I think, would want to inhabit in their absence of richness and diversity and all of that. I think one of the ways in which to make them more sophisticated is to incorporate into their logics more contemplation of how they entail a certain regulatory regime and how they interface with these sort of larger systems. And that's not to suggest that the students have to become experts in finance and economics, but to sort of question in a sort of commonsensical almost way what the implications are at that level. And I think the fascinating thing that your question entails is that the question of how a mortgage works, I think, has real programmatic implications and also representational implications, because that research you were suggesting or referring to, sort of the banks themselves are disinterested in often, I mean, there's different banks in different socioeconomic contexts, so this is a big generalization, but are often completely disinterested in questions of aesthetics, questions of form, and are looking at kind of basic notions of inhabitability and a sort of pro forma set of numbers that back that inhabitability up. I think the interesting thing is that there are, I think to myself sometimes, I mean, it's such a complex issue, but I think sometimes there are some voids almost emerging when it comes to the questions of representation, almost ideology, because of the decoupling that is going on between kind of finance-driven logics of interchangeability and fungibility and, let's say, more traditional questions of sort of architecture and representation.
If I may just interject with like a really like a vulgar like version of this problem of representations and fungibility. Now, fungibility is a word that I don't think we use very often in architecture. You know, I don't recall ever hearing the word fungible once in my entire career teaching until recently, since I've met you. So fungibility just synonymous with tradability.
In a sense,
Like
yeah.
exchangeability.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, so money's highly
Like, to make
fungible.
it things more liquid. Right?
Yeah.
So like let's say we all have a fruit and we very quickly get into the habit of trading our fruits with each other, and it's quite fungible. Banana for apple, for orange, and so on.
Right.
But then all of a sudden somebody appears with like a jawbone of some animal, and we have no idea what to make of it.
Right.
How many fruits can be traded for this jawbone?
Right.
Like,
Right.
So I think there's a very basic problem in the problem of fungibility of the thing that's out of the ordinary is not fungible.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, if finance is primarily interested in liquidity and fungibility, it will have a tendency to be against things out of the ordinary, because we don't know how to trade it or how to exchange it.
Yeah, well, that's always the paradox of anybody who makes anything. Eric can certainly talk about it. It's it occurs to me that I think many of the economic models, talk of mortgages, the power of that for doing good or bad, and the risks in the economy are super interesting to examine. But I think we have to identify which ones are helpful for architecture and which ones just are not. And many are very interesting and we need to be knowledgeable about them, but they don't all translate towards form or any kind of reconfiguring of the city. And as students and as people working on the city, if we're interested in a new kind of city formally, we have to make that differentiation. And I think it's a difficult one at times.
If
It is true. Huh?
what's fungibility means that a candy
Something
bar,
tradable, something.
it's what you eat, it changes. I don't think there's any financial context that I know of, certainly in this country or in Europe, that is interested in change.
Right.
It's interested in conventional predictability.
Right.
The shorter the term and the return, the better it is. And of course,
Right.
that's the oddity with
And they-
this. You have a mortgage, you pay it, you have a construction loan, you have permanent financing, and the building is paid for, and then it sits there for 500 years.
And they tend to
the time-
replicate, and they can replicate to their own demise. So the interesting thing about Manhattan, and Greg Pasquarelli, I think in this room, laid it all out because they had one of the towers. He said what's interesting about this model there is that New York's only allowing so many of them. And there's only one New York, right? And there's only so many towers, meaning it's limited, right? So if you want to go make 500 more, and then suddenly there's too many, and not everyone's buying them, and then they fail, and then they have to be repurposed, et cetera. So knowing that market creates this kind of weird condition. Typically, these things then are, let's do that in Los Angeles. Let's copy that and do it in Phoenix. My favorite one is, how many Silicon Valleys can there be in the world? You know, right? Then we have Silicon B. Oh, we want one of those, right? Instead of actually looking at what was the groundwork in that area of the world when Hewlett and Packard started doing stuff in their garage. Maybe it had to do with a major university nearby. Maybe it had to
It's
do with
interesting
certain other
because-
models, that you grow Silicon Valleys, you don't design them and you don't copy them, yet everyone wants to.
It's interesting because looking at these projects, it's been said like 5 times, but they are kind of like large. They're large buildings rather than small cities, and yet we're talking about all the reasons why we would be thinking in that way. And we opened this discussion with, are we going to call this post-human or post-humanist? I almost wonder if the thing that we need to define is the city. I mean, it almost seems like we're thinking. We're not actually thinking about cities here. We're thinking about larger and larger units of architecture, about objects that can be fungible, for instance, or little things that can be plugged into, what Peter was saying, an existing infrastructural system underneath. And it's almost as though that kind of tendency to copy, or that tendency, I want one. Remember when there was the Bilbao effect? And everybody wanted a Bilbao in the museum? It's kind of like that. Like now we want these kind of larger units of sort of financial reproducibility, and we're substituting the one thing for the other. And I don't know if that means that the other isn't viable anymore. That a city that develops slowly over time, it's going to be there in 500 years, and that's, you get the shape of the forum even after the forum is long gone. If that's just something that we're not capable of doing anymore, or if that is something that is being neglected in the way that we're thinking about urbanism. Because we're accidentally thinking urbanism like architects.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a question to answer, but I remember in 2006, I was invited to Phoenix, Arizona, and was asked to do a research on the growth of, And I remember I met a really fantastic guy. I think he was also called Matthew. And he was a third-generation farmer on 175th Street. Like 100. So basically his family had the whole history of Phoenix in themselves because 4th generation were living there. And it was exactly before the boom, 2008. And the parents, wanted to sell their, I think they had a kind of a a quarter square mile, They wanted to have it done. And the most interesting thing I've ever seen at that moment is when the father, came from the sleeping room and showed me the broker map, of 2006 Phoenix, Arizona. Then he explained, in 1901, the city grew every year 1 mile, And basically what has been sold were lots, And then he showed me in 2006 that in the desert, developers are making a project for 20 square miles, as one project. So what I'm just saying is, what happened in that grid is that what once was an accumulation of money for little lots turned into projects, of 20 by 20 square miles. And so this is, I think, the idea what we think a city is, that you only can design it once. You have to imagine, I remember Cerdà was saying, holy crowd, what is the right grid? Because I can only do one grid. You know, same with Manhattan, I can do, because once you make the grid, like, you know, it's defined. And I think that understanding that the city is not anymore an idea of one laying it down, it's just the accumulation of just things happening in it, yeah? And that abstractly makes the city, yeah? That, I think, is this different understanding. And why I'm saying that is because now when the question is, what is then the role of architecture? And I think this is, to me, was always interesting. I know only two examples in historical terms where a financial model was used in order to promote architecture. Because I would and probably this is my thesis, I would accumulate the opposite. The city has invented architecture, and architects gave them a shape. Okay? But there is no architect who has invented the high-rise tower. It's the city who has invented it. Yeah? And so the same goes, for example, with the one example of the garden city. The garden city is an economical model, yeah, to which the people had no idea how it should look like, but it was an idea of economy. And the other thing is the city under a single roof by Raymond Hood, yeah, who said the city cannot grow anymore as a single tower. What we have to do is we have to make an agglomeration of money. We should buy 3 blocks, and then we should make a mountain. And what came out was the Rockefeller Center. So there are in principle ideas, I would say, that I have found historically where an economical idea turns into architecture, but everything else I've seen is that architecture was there before. So the type was there before, and then it just became applied.
Well, just maybe to retreat again to my silly example of the fruit market and the jawbone, like maybe I can imagine the architect being asked to make the jawbone look like fruit. Can you do this for us? We need to make your weird thing, out of the ordinary thing, fungible. So can you make it look like fruit? I think that's one thing I can imagine the architect being asked to do. And that's just my way of saying that there's a representational problem that's always tethered to a financial one, I think. I think it's a lot more, design is way more useful than I think architects might think when it comes to allowing things to become exchangeable. I think the other thing that maybe is a happier scenario, maybe not so servile, is the architect is maybe becomes a stakeholder in the establishment of a new kind of marketplace, that we actually help develop another model. Now, that I think is maybe a difficult issue to debate, whether or not that's properly in our wheelhouse. Like just earlier, John, you said, well, we need to figure out what exactly is the job of the architect here, and why. I think you're implying it would be a mistake to maybe go too far out of that domain, because it may not be what we do ever, you know. So I think I'd like to ask you about this a little bit more, John. Like what do you think is appropriate for the architect to do here?
Well, I would be for taking all of it on, but I was only differentiating between, let's say, those models physically change the state of architecture versus ones that don't. So, vis-a-vis the image. So, while others might be infrastructurally important for the architect to participate in, I think the result of the studio and this place ending with a project and not a paper or an Excel sheet,
Right.
which could also be another way to end it, that it's an image. So therefore, the studio is always striving for what is the new, what is this offering, which I think is appropriate, should be done. I don't want to confuse that with saying that's all that an architect should be involved in, but I do think that as a profession, certainly, we need to more actively engage in those arguments. So when Eric says anybody who's doing anything deals with it all the time, either arguing against it or jujitsuing it back into another
Got a
kind of
black belt
energy,
there.
depending on how crafty one is or knowledgeable of it, that one doesn't do these things naively, that understands the economy of any kind of client, city, entity that one's participating in. So I'm all for that. In fact, I'm wishing it's more robust, both in terms of the research of it, because these things exist, incentives and building codes for developers of you need to provide this much park space, or you have to hire 3 artists, and you got to give away this piece, and it can only be this tall and that small, as well as the other things. I want you to invent something, but make it like something that's already been done, so I don't take any risks, which is always the paradox that one is in. Like, so, yes, I want something new. Absolutely, we're going to change the world. Okay, but it has to be like something done because the bankers don't want to take any risks. So.
One fundamental issue of this discussion, and all of these discussions for hundreds of years, but I think especially now, is the insistence or the need to see all the way to the end, to see all the way to the end of the city. And in that sense, the Athens Charter would be like that. I mean, if you look at, for instance, and by the way, very interesting discussion from Mumford, one of the few critics ever, I think, in the last 100. Mouchamp, Mumford, I mean, that's it. The inadequacies of the definition of what they call the functional city, without the kinds of definitions you guys are talking about, without conventional. I mean, a lot of what we have here is a function of property and the sizes of pieces of property and how that's determined and how the size of pieces of property. And now we're into economic, social, political discussions. And the sizes of property very, very much determine the nature of what you can build on the property. So if you want to change what you can build or the scope of what you can build, you have to change the pro forma for determining the size of the property. And in this country, from time to time, they have things like eminent domain, so somebody can come in and grab a chunk of property and zone it in a way that the issues that belong to single pieces of property don't pertain anymore. But there is a way to look at this, a different way, which is to say, you know what you know, you put down what you can, you anticipate what you might, and you get out. And the next characters come in and they look at it again and they bring something else, and it isn't essential to be able to anticipate every grid size or something. Not necessary. So you do what you can do in that sense with whatever conviction you bring to it, but you don't need to anticipate forever. No, but it's funny, somebody gave me George Washington's farewell address. Did you ever read that? I never, it's in the context of the current discussion. And who talks about things and is trying to see all the way to the end. What might happen to America, or what are the foibles or the dangers or something. There are actually some interesting things in it that anticipate the Civil War and so, but you don't get to see all the way to the end. And probably fortunately for him. Not to say this is the end, but the need to do that is, and the students working on this whose charge is to find a way to see what the next city will be to infinity. And that's not reasonable, and it isn't necessary to put down something essential. And it's the old Gideon story, you throw what you have into the river and the river keeps floating. and the next character throws stuff into the river. But one person doesn't have to fill up the whole river.
You know, I'm not sure if that was really the intention. I think the intention is only that will already exist. Yeah, just make it visible. You know, and it's a moment of stage at a time. You know, and I think it was not the idea. Of course, it took a little bit the idea when it was compared to the postmodern part. But in principle, I just wanted to say is that is what already exists. Now, to come back to that, this is, you know, when there was always the conflict, is there first a thought and then there comes aesthetic, or is aesthetic first, or design or the building first, and then comes a norm? Yeah. What I found really interesting is there has never been a norm first. There was always a building, an object, a thing first. Yeah? So if you look, for example, in all the kind of planning regulations, yeah, that I think sometimes come up, yeah, I have learned that the architecture triggers the norm. You know, so with the existing project, you unfold new forms of norms other than you basically constrain them. Yeah? And so I think this is what I want to bring forward, and that is why I think architecture matters, or design matters, is because it becomes the entity to which norms, regulation, politics are made. And so I think what we have done here is not to say this is the utopia, it's only this project would trigger other norms of money circulation. I think this is
Well,
what...
if I could give my own brief assessment of it, because I've been watching it. I think I can imagine two ways in which a concentrated 3-semester program can work relative to a goal. One goal might be to commit to a kind of forecast or a simulation of the real, as brutally as you can, right, and as explicitly as you can, but really forecast, like what does this idea look like subsequently, like 10 years or all the way at the end. You pick the time frame. The other way might be more practical, would be more in the form of a thought experiment, where you take certain conceptual assumptions and chop off most criteria just to focus on a single premise, and just in the 3 semesters follow it to whatever absurd or strange conclusion you might get to. And most of it might be, I don't know, not very useful ultimately, right? But there's, as you know, like we have general relativity essentially through a thought experiment, right? Without any laboratory or any money that was spent, right? So I think I am a believer to some degree in just the power of the crazy idea, just taken to its extreme. But one critique here is, regardless of what direction you go in, like how to define a certain type of project. And I think there are different ways to do a project. I think when you end up with nothing but representations, nothing but pictures, I think we're more in the first scenario that I mentioned about the fruit market of, can you make this look like something else? Or you made this thing that already looks like that and it's perfect for us, and you're waiting for the right buyer to come along. You're essentially at the mercy of a principle of fungibility of those representations. So I think what I would like to see now that this work is put on the table, I think I'd like to see if you can push it beyond just the pictures. And what's the alternative to the representation, I guess, is the obvious question I would ask. And I think the possibility is maybe what we could call modeling. You have representations, and we're very good at that here. We're very good at representations at SCI-Arc. But we may not yet be good at the modeling of scenarios or just logics or just versions of how we might interact with the world, which is not necessarily about making pictures. It might pertain more towards research and having some discursive backup, like here's actually 20 different versions of mortgage standards from around the world. And we just did that research. I think the pictures would look a lot scarier at that point if you had that kind of backup.
I'm interested in, just to follow up on that, I'm interested in the kind of the dual possibility and sort of damnation that's provided by the notion of fungibility conversation. So on the one hand, Matthew and David, you extended this, talking about fungibility as something that replicates sameness, or that allows actually new and terrifying modes of occupation, or the accumulation of capital, or the accumulation of what we would define as kind of socially unjust distribution, to exist in shapes that we don't immediately recognize for what they are. On the other hand, Peter is suggesting that architecture is what allows those norms to take shape, to populate themselves in space to begin with. In other words, you're not going to have a kind of generic that can be co-opted until you have form first. Yeah, maybe I'm not getting that nuance quite right, but so there's something here that we're saying is sort of shielding things that we don't like, and yet somehow it's within our skill set to change what objects present themselves as possibilities for that process. Seems like if we're going to do some modeling, that might be something interesting to look at.
Yeah, the only thing with the modeling I want is to me, you see, parametric urbanism, has an assumption, to me sometimes, that I can take anything from outside of architecture,
Right.
And I come and more. And I remember a debate that I had once with Patrick, and this is where my really belief deviated from Patrick, is he still started always with a formal idea, because in order to filter all the thing in, I need a grid. And I remember it was actually a student from Innsbruck, I think he did the most interesting thesis ever. He took Patrick's thesis of the paramedic literally, and he would say, how would I make a building, a system like that? It was really astonishing. The first thing was, again, a grid. You know what I mean? Something to which I either have to put something in or a number. And so I think, to me, the only worry I have sometimes, without having a thing to which the things is tested, is because you have then anyhow always an algebra grid or something to which you can start. And that's a little bit always, I think, a debate which I think could be interesting ones. What would it be, another idea of modeling,
Right. Well, it doesn't have to be parametric.
No, I'm saying, but
Right.
I'm just saying, but I mean by parametric, not only Patrick Schumacher's aesthetics,
That's right.
I mean the whole assumption
That's right.
that I have a system at stake to which I can filter in everything, and I see scenarios to come out, I remember there was a software now recently that I think looked at, and it was very funny. It looked like as if it's a model, but it still starts. Show me the grid, show me the building, It always has a thing.
if in terms of parameters, if you did something with respect to who controls the air, who controls the air. So regardless of your apprehensions of grids or the dimensions of grids or the need to change grids, and you can't, if you can change the condition spatially, if you can change it in section, it's the air rights discussion, who owns what. So can I own the air over your house? Because I want to do a house that goes over your house. So the constraints that limit building, size of properties, the issue of finance, air rights, because what the air allows you to do is it allows you to change the criteria, at least in 3 dimensions, regardless. I mean, you could take an Athens charter project and introduce a grid at a different level if you were able to, if what's in the air has the capacity to counter or to contradict what's on the ground, because the argument is always what's on the ground predetermines what's in the air. If it doesn't, then it gives you a lot more flexibility.
Yeah, exactly. I was just thinking, I mean, South Park here near Staples Center is all about the fungibility of air rights and being sold and traded. So if we make the mistake to look at that as a model and say, oh, we need to 3D model that to understand how it works, you miss the point. What we need to know is the marketplace that was set up to allow that to be bought and sold. And then maybe look at it and say, how did that happen? Like, what the hell? Why are there towers here? Why is this empty? This was sold, this was transferred. I don't think that's a parametric argument, because one can understand the marketplace as a thing full of hills, valleys, disasters, stopping, starting, non sequiturs. But it is a kind of game or strategy method which says there's a set of parameters that can be controlled through a city that could create interesting results, that could also deal with time and understanding overlay, et cetera. So that's where I would take it next, informed, though, based in some kind of reality of some of these things that might create unexpected results.
I think what's interesting about that is that it implicitly recognizes that the milieu or kind of ecosystem in which buildings and cities physically exist in is really a set of fictional constructs, right? I mean, to state the obvious, I mean, the tax regulations are inventions and they're malleable. The mortgage rules and practices are inventions and they're malleable, so on and so forth. Like, for example, it was impossible, to my knowledge, in North America to directly own anything in the sky until the 1970s, when the strata laws were introduced. Before that, it was not possible. That's like a totally new thing that has profoundly changed the world we live in. And to kind of recognize that kind of opens up, a sort of radical possibilities in terms of how one can really question and potentially reinvent how ownership works in the sky, because it's still an ongoing thing. We kind of take it for granted that this can happen, but it's so new.
It's fascinating. It's not so clear how it would be handled, because obviously, here's my building, you want to come and build over me, it affects me too.
Yeah.
The question is, what's the reciprocity between what's there and what's coming? Mm-hmm. But it's a discussion to have. Mm-hmm. And I think, as I said, I think that gives you it gives you a way to make the city a different place. Mm-hmm. And if you have to do it and simultaneously be cognizant of what you're building over, so much the better. And you have to pay attention to that too, but the fact that you pay attention doesn't preclude the possibility of actually building another city somewhere else.
I think to do this in an interesting way, this kind of modeling is to sort of envision the sort of scope of architectural discourse and potentially agency as spanning this sort of elastic spectrum that includes representation, aesthetics, form, regulation, lending practices, like all in this, right? Like that you might invent a form that to kind of make it animate necessitates a new notion of a tax law, for instance, to incentivize it. And I think it's potentially empowering. I mean, it's not to overstate.
One way to do that is the Yen-Ting thing is like this. You build over the infrastructure because you have enormous rights-of-way, power grids, freeways, trains, dams, all of this, which present different kinds of ownership issues. So buildings over buildings, I mean, there are lots of discussions about freeways, under freeways, above freeways. And not only that, certainly in this city, I mean, this city is zoned by freeways. I mean, you're north of the 10, you're south of the 10, you're west of the 405, you're east of the 405. And building over freeways or using freeways as sites for buildings of a different scale, not cities, but in this place, the pieces of cities, which might mean you wouldn't have to be limited by the perimeter of the freeway. So now you got the Ponte Vecchio between west of the 405 and east of the 405, which happens to engage the freeway under it, on it, over it. And it actually would be a way of stitching the city back together, so it wouldn't be subdivided by the freeways.
You know,
And that would be a subject too.
in the early 1990s, there was a California senator named Leroy Green who was actually a civil engineer. And he proposed legislation called the Space Saver Schools. And it was in reaction to the amount of land school districts had to buy based on the Department of Education requirements. So you had to buy acres to do a school, and you couldn't build a school in the city, essentially. It resulted in a few projects, which you'd expect, playgrounds on top of schools with parking, right? Not that this was novel. But at one point, there were discussions about building schools over the LA River. So in other words, the state of California says, school district, you're going to build a school. You need to buy the property. The school district applies for it. They say, I need $10 million to buy a property, so I have all this area. So the idea is, no, take the $10 million and use it for structure, because there is no land. You just need an access point. There are actual models, and people have thought of some of these things that it's not that it always didn't get legs. But in other words, the idea of the legislature, right, how to make something without land, then you can have many different interpretations of that. And that's, I see maybe the studio can develop into that, like that initial problem statement, which doesn't really know what the solution is. So I gave you the one, okay, bridges over the LA River. There may be many other models, digging under the ground for that matter, or tunneling.
The river's actually a perfect venue for that. And you wouldn't have to say, nobody needs, say, take the whole damn river and do it. All you need to do is go over here and take 500 feet and say, let's try it out. And if you could get somebody to do that, that's conceivable.
I think
And then you have a completely different urban venue with property owned and regulated in entirely different ways. And just the form language of the river and the concrete, are going to give you something very different.
that's a real super simple example that I gave. I would expect it would be much more complex levels of three-dimensionality, air rights, all sorts of things that creates a kind of new legislation, building codes approach that still admits all the experts you have on economy within the studio to be able to be plausible. This, I think, it could be really interesting. That's how
Sounds
I
like
see
you might have a project here. Huh? All right.
I did want to remind us of one thing that Eric said in the beginning, which I thought was interesting, and it's only just now, like I've only just now digested it. With all of this talk about finance and the role that development plays in our cities, there are other things that have historically shaped cities. It's sort of the horrific example of Albert Speer's architectural vision, for instance. I feel like it's important for us to remember that there are other things that shape cities.
Oh, yeah.
They have, well, you know, I talked about the Lisbon earthquake, you know, disaster shaped cities. We haven't talked a lot about risk in this conversation, which is interesting. But there are also other positive things, and when I don't mean positive like good, I mean positive like positing something that produces form, that is powerful enough to get things built. I don't know how we begin to talk about those. We seem to have gotten to the place in our discourse where we only recognize economic forces as givens, and maybe, especially considering what's going on in our world today, we're going to have to start rethinking some of those assumptions and pay more attention to some of the other possibilities for what shapes space.
I mean, from a historical point of view, I think as you have, you could probably observe how absolutely
weird this hyper-focus on money is in this era, and we can't assume that's forever either. You know?
Well, look, the guy who is president wants to do, I mean, the Chinese wants to build a wall. There probably is a hell of a interesting wall you could build, you can facilitate people coming with drugs and they can rest for the night and then go across the border facetiously. But you could make something like that. We did that. I think I showed it to you.
Yeah.
There was a discussion a few years ago in the Foreign Affairs section in the New York Times that people designed the border, which is so something like that, which you could argue has very little to do with the cost of it, although in the political discourse in this place, it seems to be an issue. But the meaning of something like that, or Nuremberg, or walls in China, or for that matter, big pieces of infrastructure like you could make an argument. I think there was a discussion when Eisenhower did this, that the freeway system in America was designed to move armies. In the same way Haussmann cut up Paris. And Haussmann cut up, you can argue about the Baltard pavilions or something, but he knocked down too many. But at least part of that discussion had to do with moving armies around.
And preventing barricades.
Right.
Well, there is a
Following
nice,
consent.
Foucault, I think, wrote it very nicely in his book on biopolitics, that the grid, was not only army, it was social control, it was economical circulation, it was everything that it need. You see, here, to me, and perhaps I contradict something I say, but I remember, of course, there are many people looking at the city, and the city for them is an excitement. Yeah? And I think what John brought up is, it's really the question, should architects consider that what architects should do on the city, yeah? Or should they go to anything else outside of architecture? And I remember, a guy like Hollein would say in a conversation in the 1970s with some German sociologist, the city is made out of buildings and I do buildings, yeah? And no, the city is about people, yeah? But no, he says, it's buildings. And so I think this point, this question, I think, to which sense is the role of the author, of the architect in that whole game, and what is it really its product or its entity or its thing that he or she can deliver, I think will always be at stake. Yeah? And the only reason is I'm totally interested in everything else than architecture, but the funny thing is it always accumulates in a form. Yeah? And I guess if that is taken away, and it's only the Excel sheet or something else, then I think it can only be done by someone who would understand what that Excel means. And so I'm not saying that I'm a disciplinary fetishist, yeah, but I still would say that it's the only place until which you can say something, or at least I. Yeah.
But the point, I think, the essential point is it's never money, actually. Money is always sitting on some assumption, some assumptions about what's needed or wanted.
Yes, it's a desire.
All of that. And those motivations and those concerns and those interests that drive a lot of this, it then may result in policies and may result in ways of handing out money or not handing out money, depending on the nature of the project. But to try to understand what money means, which was an issue I raised at the beginning. What is it sitting on? What determines how it's spent? And it's more than money in and what's coming back and how fast. I think you could argue over a long, long period of time that's a byproduct. A short-term byproduct.
But I think it's a really good point. I think a critical question is if the current position of building in the economy has transformed things to a degree that we could say it is actually about money. It's not about sitting on anything else anymore. that's a question. I don't know whether that's the case, but I think it's a valid question. And then another thing I would say in relation to an earlier comment is architecture's always looked at other things than money. It's almost never looked at money. It's always the other stuff. So the other things are not unimportant, but maybe a kind of, there's a kind of version of some different type of agency that arises by looking at it directly.
Well, if you listen to the way this idiot talks about his buildings, there may be the question, Adler, Freud, Jung, Adler, a different generation,
No.
is a pretty well-known psychoanalyst who, to shortchange him, has something to do with questions of power.
Sure, yeah.
And manifestations of power and potency. And so a lot of these buildings, you can say it costs this and it costs that, but when you listen to these characters talk about that, they're symptomatic of authority and power, and they are, and they're physiological manifestations of that. Now, you could discuss the power of what or who or to what end or why, to what extent they belong to an individual or to a group or to a government or to a country. But I think that component also, like, I did this, you didn't, talks like that. But even when they don't talk like that, the question is that to what extent is that a factor in all of this? So walls mean something like that, and towers might mean something like that, and more towers means conceivably more of that. There's more of a psychological motivation for that.
But isn't that what David's argument was trying to go beyond that? To say, if these buildings represent so much money, and but they're kind of now autonomous from that expression of power, that they're trying to hide that they're any different from any of the other buildings. They're not even occupied. That the power they represent is exclusively a financial power. Then doesn't that make that the old rationale seem to be undermined? I guess I'm becoming a
well, but in what time frame does that apply? You put the tower up, it's going to be there for 300 years.
Right.
The people who are bitching about whether you paid the mortgage are hasta la vista in 25 years. So there's a gap of 250 years. What happens then?
Oh, I also just wonder, is there something useful in, even if you're building a tower that's ridiculous like this, then can there not be a useful opportunity in the kind of moment of giving form, right? Because the money doesn't care necessarily what the form looks like, but that the architect has that space, that slippage, that it needs to have some sort of form, and therefore that form can be one thing or another. That maybe in that moment you have that chance to act not only on that tower, but maybe on the system that creates it, because it's just in the kind of in that space where it has to take some sort of form that it gives you the chance for the architect to have that agency again.
I guess the disturbing thing is the idea of maybe the systems and models we put together, and maybe not the ones we'll do in the studio, but the ones that we have right now in the marketplace and on the trading floor, the current ones, when models and systems kind of take a life of their own, and really there is no I did this anymore, that it's basically mechanized and automated, like high-frequency trading, resulting in a crash or enormous profit. Like no one said, I made that profit or I made it crash, that the model itself is somehow running by itself to some degree. So I think these zombie buildings are a little bit like that. Like who would have thought, like Alan Greenspan could not have anticipated when he smashed down the interest rates on federal treasury bonds that it would produce this gigantic bubble in the residential real estate market, like 10 years ago. He wouldn't have dreamed that something like this could have happened, right? Yeah. But the policies that were put in place then kind of take a life of its own.
But don't you think it's always the rub against all of those systems that's always most interesting. So like those buildings are going to get built, and maybe some of them will become timeshares. They actually will be occupied, or maybe So I was reminded of there was an article. I think it was last year. I talked to Benjamin Bratton about this. The app Waze, right? The wayfinding to get efficiently driving in different areas. So off the 405 in Brentwood, there's one street that started, it's just a little residential street and it's near the freeway. It just started getting inundated with cars, right? Like, because Waze was sending people, like, get off the freeway and get back on, like a little shortcut, right? So what's interesting about that, and that's happening all over, so it's changing traffic patterns, it's changing how we're moving through the city, it's like traffic engineers are trying to deal with this, it's like, what is it doing? It's not necessarily making it efficient, but it's just changing how we go through. So the people in the neighborhood all took their phones, they logged onto Waze, and they left their phones in their car to make it look like there was traffic. So that Waze would read it as traffic and not send anybody there. So they're trying to get around the system, right? So then it turns out Waze recognizes that and comes back, and there's this other fight. Meanwhile, the whole community hates Waze and says, what are we going to do? Let's put a stop sign or
bumper-to-bumper traffic.
Cul-de-sac. So I don't know, with all these, because I think there's a tendency, of course, to say, oh, this is the future, it's parametric, it's all going to be algorithmic, and it's going to work perfect, just like the freeways were going to work perfect, just like the trains were going to work perfect, just like the channel, the river was going to work perfect. And they never do, and then they're actually a whole accumulation of all these things. And so as these new things happen, like I was thinking about Airbnb, to the hotel industry, this was terrifying. Terrifying. It's like, we don't need hotels anymore. You literally don't need hotels. We could, just through Airbnb, house everybody who comes in and distribute all that wealth. It's no longer centralized, and it's not Trump's sign, just rip it down. You want to kill that? Make a system that does it. These things are existing and grapple with are incredibly powerful, very powerful architecturally. And then, of course, there's repercussions. And then, Santa Monica doesn't let you rent out your house more than 2 weeks long, so you can't make money, you can't do it, and it saves the hotels. So it's like push pull with all these things. I think it's really interesting to not adopt them just as, well, this is how it's going to be, but what kind of fissures is that going to cause? What is it doing?
Yeah, just to add on that in a very obvious way. I mean, if we just take, these sort of zombie towers in Manhattan are not just a phenomenon in Manhattan. I mean, there's probably about 40 cities in the world in which there are significant portions of them that have high vacancy rates, owned but occupied, right? So it's 40 cities with 30 to 40% vacancy and significant portions. It's millions and millions and millions of square feet, tons of units. If we just take that, who knows how long that will exist? These things fluctuate and change, but as a given now, what does one do with that surplus of space, right? Are there, and I think there's some fascinating architectural questions around just that. That have to do with typology, also have to do with potentially technology. Is there some sort of synthesis between the shared economy and technologies of that and architecture and space making that facilitate the desires for people to invest in these spaces and leave them empty, but then capitalize on them in such a way that is totally unknown, But I think that's one example of a really rich question from my perspective.
If you go really precisely, what is so interesting on this small tower, I think I would be interesting to see a really formal and economical analysis. Because originally the tower, to my knowledge, emerged, with the commercialization of companies, the idea of a new form of labor coming into the metropolis. So the first tower was not housing, the first tower was office space. Then we see a whole history of the tower, moving into pure forms of administration, office landscape, and so on. Now, what we have never thought is that a tower suddenly becomes, and so what turned into money was rent, and not owning. So what becomes now fascinating is that we have written millions of books of structural engineering, yeah? How the depth of the floor plate becomes a core versus a facade because the depth of the floor plate allowed you to make this. And suddenly there comes a tower where the floor plate of an office space becomes replaced by a single house, makes it suddenly to a very thin thing. It doesn't have a core of gigantic amount of elevators, it has only 2 elevators because of the hotel and frequency. And so what we see suddenly is there is a new type emerging, yeah? That is what I would call the method of replacement, yeah? It's just other things have been replaced, yeah? To something that becomes new. Housing have been replacing office space, yeah? Rent has replaced ownership, yeah? And so that's why I think becomes an interesting study, that what we conceive suddenly as something unique is a new type emerging, yeah? Because it has changed to the understanding what was just before a variation of tower turns into a new type of tower.
You know, perhaps one direction to explore is new ways to bundle together forms of investment, because right now we have an incredibly reduced, minimized, standardized unit of investment, that is the mortgage for a private property. We get nothing but repetitive floor plates, or outside of cities, repetitions of standardized detached housing that just spreads everywhere, like in Houston, for example. I mean, and that's what we see in the last couple of days. And it's the complete reduction to a single type that, as a consequence of a single type of financing, that might be maybe the biggest thing to get beyond. So just like maybe some of these discredited investment vehicles were famous for bundling together weird collections of mortgages. Maybe there could be a similar kind of creative idea you come up with here, in the program, of other kinds of bundles of financing that could produce richer, more robust architectural parallels, like things that go with it, so that you don't get the completely dehumanized, post-human, repetitive, nonstop pencil towers, or infinite spread of piles, or homogeneity in the burbs. You get variegation, form, new types, maybe. Well, we're wrapping up, so I'd like to give the people who are patiently listening to us a chance to interject with a comment or a question. Usually they're comments, but I would prefer a question. But do we have any final things we want to add to this? Yeah, we're good. I think we're good. Okay. All right. Yeah. Our policy man. Yeah.
My question is, I just want to...
Oh, wait for the mic. Yeah.
All right. So the question is, what is the city? And so what makes an ideal city? And then why is the city that we have now, or the cities that we're building now, are bad? And so I guess my idea then is, how do we get from this city to that city? What's the navigation path?
Can I say something very funny? The city was always a place of total struggle. Yeah? It's really interesting. I think it would be nice if all the books that I've read about the city, yeah, the great thing is that every stuff is happening there. Yeah? Everything. Yeah? Bad things, worst things, fantastic things. Yeah? And I think if there's anything that I like, or I've chosen to live in a city and not on the countryside, yeah, is because it's all these failures, yeah, and all the kind of struggle, yeah, that actually makes the city. Yeah? And I think there will be no architecture, to my knowledge, that will help it, yeah, to make it better. Yeah? But of course, one thing you could say is that, strangely enough, historically, there have been some cities made that we like more than others. Yeah. Now, what that intriguing phenomena is, I have no idea, but I guess it is the agglomeration of accidents, built onto each other, cultures that have mutated, that made it. But you see, that's what I think is such a tricky question, because the city is, to me, a cultural phenomena. Yeah, it's so difficult to even understand. Perhaps the city is the best hyper-object. We have no really idea of what it does. So when you say, what is a better city? It is a really, it would be a question, what is bad on the city? Because it's the only thing we humans have, It's really, to me, the only interesting human interventions that we have made to accumulate and live together, So I think there's a kind of fundamental idea. Now, one thing I totally agree to you, the city is only 3,000 years old. That means it started around 5,000 years old, because it started around 2,500 in whatever, Euphrat degrees, So, of course, there was 500,000 years we were just hunting around, like in the wilderness. Then we decided to make a city, but I think the question will be, there might be once the time that we don't live in a city anymore, because we have not ever lived in one, And I think, to me, that idea, I think Lefebvre once said very nicely that people argued that the city, to which we understand as a cultural entity, might have already vanished with the Middle Ages, and with industrialization, that what we have today is just a gigantic, expansion of inhabitation. So I think you're right to say, what is a good one? But my question would be, there will never be a good one.
Well, I don't know. I think I disagree in some ways, because I think city is like one of these things, like I know one when I see it, but we say that about those things that are too complex to reduce to a definition. Right? So I know a criminal when I see one, or I know porn when I see it, like the famous Supreme Court judge said, like any thing that's too complex to resist a single definition, I think we say that. But what that means is, I think it's a matter of history and historical understanding. The only way we know at all and can recognize it, like the fact that I can know a city when I see it, right, is because of my historical understanding of all the cities I've seen and all the experiences I've had.
But in a broadest sense, if you say a city is a museum, but not in a controlled environment, and it's a museum of human aspiration, and it's probably the aspiration of the people who ran the city. And as that changes, as who controls the city changes, and as the aspirations change or don't, that might give you a way to see what would be happening next. Who's going to control the city? What are their interests?
Yeah. Well, the reason why I answer...
That's a political answer and a cultural answer.
I'm trying to say, I think it's a mistake to try to put it in terms of is it good or is it bad? Because it's too complex. You can only answer that relative to a definition, and then say, does this instance of it contradict the definition? And that's the only way you would really say good or bad. Otherwise, you're just talking about personal preference, which, we'll see where that gets you. But for example, Houston's really on my mind. I mean, most architects would say, or anybody interested in cities would say, that's a really shitty city, because it's just nonstop sprawl, and it's just a mess. There's no infrastructure and so on. But I think as an inhabitant, like what you hear in the news is a lot of comments about the unusual degree of solidarity in Houston, what a strong identity it has, and I think it would be a mistake to say that's a bad city. Based
It's
on
also a
certain
very
criteria.
political city.
Yeah,
It
deeply.
belongs to a particular part
Contested,
of the
yeah.
country,
Yeah.
which has a particular social and political point of view. As far as I know, there are no zoning laws
Yeah.
there.
Yeah,
At least,
yeah.
at least.
It's famous for
there
having
are
no
some-
zoning.
But which is supposed to be a manifestation of freedom to do things, which is what they claim to be
Mm-hmm. That's right.
about.
It's an,
That's certainly
it's
a
an
debatable-
ideology. It's
debatable
quintessentially American city.
but it belongs, I think, to the context, to the politics, to the sociology, to those who control decision-making there, to some extent, to a large degree, explains what it is, at least organizationally. I think it does. So it is what it is. You wouldn't find that city in too many other places. And I think a lot of that is because of the politics.
I mean, so I just want to say, like, I really don't want to say what's a good or bad city, but in general, in the problem of city design in general, just what finance is doing through instruments like the mortgage, in producing repetition without distinction, and with design deployed not for the experience of any individual, but as a kind of secondary effect of the instruments, financial instruments. I think this is a problem to confront. I don't think it's like a happy story that we say, this is wonderful, let's keep rolling with it. I think it's a problem with very provocative, negative, and potentially positive effects that I don't think has been properly assessed. So I think it's the problem that's on the table in general. Yeah. And whether or not it gets us to a better place or not I myself think it's actually not the right question, because I seriously doubt it will be any better than.
And priorities
already
change. If you look at this city now, there's an enormous program with the council and Garcetti with a ton of money to build affordable housing, which for years has been a mess from one end of this country to the other, and continues to be. But there's a commitment now in this city. We'll see how it evolves, but there's an enormous commitment to change something which has been a mess for years and years. So the values might evolve, or people in authority might see the world differently. I think architecture can contribute to that discussion, for sure.
I do too.
You see it this way, you ought to see it that way.
But what is interesting on your question is, if you think about that, is there had been historically always one city within a particular moment of time which people thought that's a good one, So I think it is interesting that you say, well, Venice is the middle-aged city, or Barcelona or Manhattan is the grid, and Los Angeles is the industrialized. Yeah? So I think there is something fascinating that certain cities, or the Greek city is the political city, and I think that there is something interesting. I think that certain moments in history, have accumulated some cities that we all agree somehow, we might have liked. But I think from a political point of view, and I think it would be really interesting once to understand, and there's only one theorist that I know who says the city is a political construction, of Rossi. But I think is the form, and the politics, what if the politics would go into another form, Or is the form and the politics two different things, That will be an interesting, I think, research wants to know,
Another one? Danny?
I'm going to formulate the question as I speak because it's coming up, but it's on this idea of politics. I'm glad it's being brought up towards the end because I think it's actually what you just said, Peter, is very important in the way that cities are formulated or the way that cities are changed. I'd just be curious if you guys can talk on that a bit more. For example, you keep on talking about the zombie buildings in Manhattan. I think it's less about investment than it is about money laundering, international money laundering. There was an expose that New York Times did about all of the foreigners who are sort of buying these apartments through shell companies, and they're international criminals or they bad businesses in other countries, and they're sort of using these buildings as a place to find refuge, rescue. Or take Havana, for example, where one day it's a city, and the next day, because of political shift, the city becomes distributed across the entire country. So I'm just, and other places in Latin America where there's lots of capital investment which then all of that sort of value gets displaced very quickly because of a political whim. So just hoping you guys can sort of expand on the political side of that.
Well, Matthew, you've done a lot of research in this area.
Well, it's a super. I mean, it's an interesting question. I think the the political framework in which buildings operate and exist within is undoubtedly a significant factor in how they perform and the kind of role they serve in society. And the examples you brought up are indicative of that. I think, the term political economy kind of, and as an area of disciplinary research exists for a reason, and because the economic system is, it's not as if any economic paradigm is separate from politics. In fact, we could say that maybe that's where politics resides most intensely, is in terms of the sort of economic system in which it exists. I think the examples you give, like the money laundering and others, are further illustrations of how it's now a very common thing that buildings serve a role that is in addition or separate from what we think often as their traditional role as a place of bodily inhabitation. I mean, I think there's so many fascinating examples. In Ireland, there are what are called zombie hotels, and there are these fascinating structures that are often at in locations that don't seem to make sense for a hotel, and also at sizes that don't really make obvious sense. And the only way I can figure out to kind of make quote unquote sense of them is when you look at the tax regulations in Ireland, and you figure out that there was a sort of loophole that allowed developers of housing to shelter their profits by building hotels, because the government created this law to incentivize hotel construction because they believed the country didn't have enough support for tourism. But the hotels couldn't just be built, they needed to be operated for a certain period of time for the developers to get the tax benefits. So they operate them, though, in a manner where it's not about actually having guests, it's just having a kind of legal notion of representation. So I visited some of these, and you arrive and you can go in, but there's nobody around, and you ring a bell and somebody comes 15 minutes later and you say, "Can I get a room?" And they're like, "Do you really want to stay here?" Like, yeah, I really want to stay here. But I think, so that's architecture, and they built, tons of these, so it's a form of kind of urbanism in the landscape. The only way to understand it is buildings operating at a kind of financial regulatory nexus that helps certain people profit in a certain way. Like Canada has, there's been some studies that demonstrate how a certain percentage of the new building is facilitating citizenship for immigrants from around the world that need to be able to attain citizenship to demonstrate they're investing a certain amount of money in the country. So there's building and housing functioning as immigration device. So tax laundering devices, tax sheltering devices, immigration devices, investment devices. I mean, I think you can weave this all together as part of or sort of illustrative cases for this kind of if we go back to that originary term for today's discussion, kind of post-humanist state. Does that address your question?
It's complex. I think we could certainly use some more research in what's going on. I mean, I'm not saying ourselves in particular, but I'm just surprised that it's not more studied right now. You know, it seems to be such a powerful phenomena in urbanism today, and it just doesn't seem to be looked at enough. You know, and there are notable figures researching this, like Sasson has been studying this quite deeply, but why not? Why isn't everybody studying?
And it's interesting that it's these different examples you can find around the world, all are shaped by very particular local contexts, right? So like what may be happening in Cuba is very particular to Cuba, and then what's happening in Ireland with the case of the zombie hotels is very particular to the rules and regulations that exist there. So there's all these kind of local particularities, but when you sort of zoom out and look at them collectively, they seem to represent a set of global kind of common phenomena. And then it's so hard to trace the particularities of the money and how it moves around. But it would appear that you know the developers that are benefiting from the zombie hotels in Ireland are funded by Northern European lending banks in like France and Germany that also invested heavily and benefited from the subprime mortgages and the bundling that happened in the United States. So all these sort of local particularities and then global similarities, but then animated by continuities of finance, continuities of money, right?
What's interesting to me about all of this is that I like that there's zombie hotels in Ireland. I like that there's this additional element beyond, that the buildings are always more than the things that they satisfied, that led to their construction, and the possibility of the city that we kind of keep hearing in different ways, that Eric was trying to push before, but that we've all been thinking of in kind of different frames, is built on that extra space, not that room for something else to come afterward. That's why Eric was so insistent about the historicity of the kind of inherited city, which is actually mostly a fabrication for vast swaths of the city, where like most of the urban fabric we have now is the first building to occupy that space, if we look at the kind of sprawl of kind of a global urbanity. But the kind of promise that was in that inheritance is just that there's more there than the one thing that was being put to use, and that was supposed to be a good answer to that solution. And that's the possibility of the urban. That's the messiness that Peter was describing about, like the kind of the non-optimal city, the kind of struggling and like the failure. Like the failure creates the space, and that's what makes the city the city. And so it's good for architects that these buildings have that extra amount that can never be reduced to the things that they do. It's the space in which we operate.
I just want to get one thing back where you're both right. I have discovered something, of course I'm European in a certain way, that there was the idea that life will be orchestrated by an idea of pension, so about money rather than real estate, which means you pay into a pension system and it comes. But what have really interested me in the kind of research towards money and the city was the book, that I was going around about Thomas Piketty, who made us aware that probably the 21st century will be about, for many people, the asset growth of investment of buildings will be their financial, you could say, base for their future, and not anymore what they earn. And so I think the city, in that sense, as a gigantic amount of asset entity, will be the social struggle, to which I think we all have to witness. And I remember, just as a city of Vienna, until now, recently, it was only
cities like London, that had Chinese or Russians. But I might be now in cities in Vienna that you are going to pay your rent, into Arabs in the future. So that idea that you might need an asset in order to survive will play a really interesting role, because the salaries in Europe are growing 1%, but your property grows 5%. So that whole idea of what an asset is going to do as a social organization in the city, I think that's still, and I think with your question of the good and the bad and but the money is lying underneath all of that. And so I totally agree, we will have something to think of.
I'm sorry to do this, but we're at 7 o'clock. Come back for day 2 tomorrow for architectural technologies. Thank you for panelists. Thank you to the students. See you tomorrow.
Thank you.